Suez crisis took place over 4 months in 1956. It started with President Nasser of Egypt's decision to nationalize the Suez Canal, which runs through northeast Egypt and links the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. The Suez Canal was a vital trade route and had, until 1956, been administered as an international waterway. Nasser's decision to take over the canal and administer it as a part of Egypt prompted an international crisis. We're going to look at 2 films in this programme on Film Century, which help to explain why the crisis in Suez caused such a sensation. One is an Egyptian film, made to condemn the Anglo-French aggression. The other is a British overseas film, designed to dismiss the Egyptian claims. Here's how the Egyptian film explains what has gone on in Port Said after nationalisation. We've added subtitles when necessary because of the poor sound quality of the surviving film.
Port Said had a charm of its own that attracted thousands of tourists every year. But its major importance lay in its position at the entrance to the Suez Canal. Port Said had gained in importance since the nationalisation of the Suez Canal Company. The nationalisation law brought more activity to Port Said, which received all ships coming from the west. The pilots were particularly busy to meet the pressure of the sea traffic in that part of the world. There was enthusiasm among all personnel, for if prior to the nationalisation law they worked for a handful of foreign investors, they were now working for their own country, and their efficiency was a national duty.
And this is how the British film describes the way in which Nasser came to power, likening him to Adolf Hitler and the Egyptian capital Cairo to the German capital Berlin in 1939.
Revolution in Egypt, and before long Colonel Nasser became dictator. In Cairo, as in other Middle Eastern capitals, popular endorsement of this ominous event produced scenes of frenzied acclamation. Promises of peace and prosperity for every Egyptian explain the enthusiasm for a regime which has proved incapable of fulfilling them. Russia was supplying arms for Nasser's often declared intention of wiping Israel off the map. The climax came when Nasser seized the Suez Canal, an international waterway. To Britain and France, this was a danger signal that the whole Middle East might soon be aflame. Cairo in 1956 reminded many of Berlin in 1939. Warlike signs in the streets, together with violent radio propaganda, starkly revealed the mood of Egyptian defiance. Nasser himself created and sustained the uncompromising and bellicose attitude. He'd made no secret of his intentions. He'd already seized the canal. What next?
What next, indeed? The unfolding story of the Suez crisis is described very differently in the 2 films. Notice that the Egyptian film tells us that there was an Anglo-French conspiracy and that Israel was ordered to launch an attack in the direction of the Suez Canal.
On the 29th of October 1956, the sinister imperialistic conspiracy was exposed. On that fateful day, Israel was ordered to launch an attack in the direction of the Suez Canal to provide a pretext for the major plan of Anglo-French military intervention in the canal. Israel was to become the cat's-paw of Anglo-French imperialism. What Eden and Mole seemed to have forgotten was the unshakable determination of the Egyptian people not to surrender their right to full independence, sovereignty and national dignity. Eden and Mole's planes began to attack Egyptian towns and cities. Their treacherous aggression on Egypt had begun. Bombs were dropped indiscriminately. Then the raiders took the Suez Canal maintenance workshops at Ismailia for a deliberate target. They were heavily damaged. It was indeed strange that Eden and Mole should actually destroy what they claimed they were intervening to protect.
Eden and Mole were cast as the villains in that Egyptian film. They were the prime ministers of Britain and France who took the decision to send troops in to occupy the area around the Suez Canal, without discussing the matter first with the United States of America or other allies. Britain and France denied arranging for the Israelis to attack across the Sinai Desert. This is how the British film describes the moment when Israel invaded Egypt, implying that it happened shortly after Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal.
He'd made no secret of his intentions. He'd already seized the canal. What next? At this tense moment, on the 29th of October, Israel struck. Routing the Egyptians, Israeli columns swept forward across Sinai towards the canal. Together on the 30th of October, Britain and France issued a forthright warning to both countries. Israel was prepared to heed it. Egypt refused point blank. The Anglo-French operation was planned with care and skill to achieve its objective with the minimum loss of life. In the Mediterranean, aircraft carriers and other warships were ready to take part in the action. And for the first time in history, attacking forces announced their objectives and the time of the attack. At additional risk to air crews, the Egyptian people were warned by precise and repeated broadcasts to keep away from airfields and other specified military targets.
Although the Anglo-French forces had no stated intention of hitting civilian targets, the Egyptian film made it quite clear that civilian targets had been hit and that the suffering had been widespread.
There was destruction and more destruction. Nevertheless, Egypt remained firm and united. The Anglo-French command cut off the water supply in Port Said, and the inhabitants had to resort to the emergency fire taps. The Anglo-French horrors.
Let's look at how each opposing film concludes its account of the 48-hour attack on Port Said.
It was inevitable that some damage should occur in Port Said during the fighting that followed the rejection of the ceasefire. It was chiefly due to fires caused by exploding ammunition dumped by the Egyptians in the slums of the town. A view of the place from the air shows conclusively by the clear-cut limits of the damage that this was not done by bombing. Anyone looking at this picture can easily see for himself. Port Said had suffered very little damage. For example, public utilities such as the waterworks captured by the French were unscathed. Nasser's propaganda, by the way, claimed that the greater part of the town had been smashed by bombing from the air and by bombardment from the sea. It doesn't look like it, does it? These flyover pictures were taken on the 22nd of November. And if the place had been bombed from the air or bombarded from the sea, you'd expect to see some signs somewhere. No bombs were dropped. Only a few defined military targets were attacked by shells and rocket fire. The Egyptians said that the entire population was destitute and 50,000 homeless. Absolute nonsense. House after house, street after street, and not a vestige of destruction can be seen. Port Said was never a target, only military objectives on its fringes. Port Said in ruins? Well, take a look at Port Said.
The British film uses aerial shots of Port Said, which distance us as viewers from what had gone on during the fighting for the city. The Egyptian film, on the other hand, relies on close-up pictures, which have more emotional impact.
While Port Said was making a heroic stand, women and children, the maimed and the sick, were taking refuge in more secure areas. Every means of transport was used to evacuate those unfortunate people, most of them rendered homeless as a result of indiscriminate bombing by Anglo-French aircraft. The government supplied all facilities for the evacuation. The refugees were exhausted after so many days of ruthless bombing and machine gunning by Eden Mole's pilots. But faith remains. Our motto today is unity, strength, work, and determination. The whole world is with us.
We can start to make sense of those two opposing accounts on film because we know a lot more about what really happened. Many secret government records about the Suez crisis are more than 30 years old and have therefore recently been made available. They help to analyse the crisis in Suez. We now know that Britain and France did help to arrange the Israeli invasion.
Israel was ordered to launch an attack in the direction of the Suez.
As the Egyptian film said, it was an imperialist conspiracy to try to take back control of the Suez Canal.
Israel was to become the cat's-paw of Anglo-French imperialism.
We do know about the casualty figures, although when the two films were made in late 1956, the estimates by the British and the Egyptians differed widely.
Casualties, too, were very small in number, in spite of Egyptian propaganda stories to the contrary. The same care and attention was given to Egyptian wounded as our men themselves would receive. A hospital train for Cairo went out half empty.
Hospital wards in Egypt are swarming with victims, with unfortunate civilians who only yesterday lived in peace. They lived in peace until Eden and Mole gave orders for mass destruction. Surgeons were busy day and night performing operations and extracting bullets from the bodies of unfortunate civilian victims machine-gunned in the streets by the ruthless aggressors.
An independent study of the records concluded that on the Egyptian side there had been 750 dead and 950 wounded, many more than the British had at first claimed. And the Anglo-French losses were 23 dead and 121 wounded.
Then the raiders took the Suez Canal maintenance workshops at Ismailia for a deliberate target.
Film tells a story with words and pictures. It helps to know who took the original pictures and to know whether sound was recorded at the time of filming or added later. Some of these pictures came from ITN, Independent Television News, based in London. Television cameras were able to get close to the action and record what was going on. And from these ITN pictures, we can see that there's no doubt that the city of Port Said was damaged by shell fire, which came from Royal Navy guns stationed on ships offshore. Bombs had been dropped nearby. An oil depot blew up. Fighting in the city was fierce in the 2 days before the ceasefire on the night of the 6th of November. The ITN footage was recorded without sound because the editors in charge of the programme didn't send a sound recordist with their cameraman. This ITN news is read from the bulletin of the 8th of November 1956.
In the canal area, the situation is quiet. The latest Allied communiqué says there is nothing to report. Later in this bulletin, we shall be showing you the first pictures from Port Said, taken by our cameraman Cyril Page as he went ashore with British assault troops. It was officially announced this afternoon that, as far as is known, the British casualties for all 3 services in Egypt are no higher than 85, of which not more than 20 were killed. This is in spite of the tough resistance encountered at Port Said. Paratroopers paved the way, then in came the seaborne forces, with them Cyril Page. The statue of de Lesseps was untouched. This was an old familiar scene, a reminder of the Normandy coast a dozen years ago. Only hours before, bombers and jet fighters were in action nearby. Trouble can still lie round any corner. Tanks move in for a show of force along streets which, a few months ago, thronged with tourists. And there's one more familiar sight, the bewildered column of prisoners.
Here's how the British overseas film uses some of the same shots, complete with words and music.
Some of Nasser's troops had fought in civilian clothes. In fact, it was often difficult to distinguish civilians from soldiers.
The British and French invasion of the Suez Canal ended in humiliation for both countries. They had to withdraw their forces amid worldwide condemnation. The Suez Crisis was a key moment in the decline of British and French imperial power. President Nasser had accepted military aid from the Soviet Union and was accused of holding the West to ransom over his control of oil supplies through the Suez Canal. It was thought by many in the West that Nasser should be deposed, but he was not. He remained president of Egypt for another 14 years. On the 21st of November 1956, United Nations forces moved in to keep the peace on the canal. After a confused start, the UN settled in and the Egyptians accepted their presence. It was generally agreed the United Nations made a good job of repairing the damage caused by the Suez crisis.